welcome. And again, thanks for joining us today. Let's go down the line here and we'll start with Robin.
Sure. My name is Robin Black. I'm the party crasher here. I'm actually VP Exploration and not a CEO. Apologies if you were expecting a CEO. I've been with the company since we've started in 2015. We're a private company, so again, a little bit of the odd duck at this forum. But we have been working on the Kathrichak project since 2015, and it's currently completed its EA, and we are in the licensing process at the moment.
Great. Brandon?
Hi everyone, I'm Brandon Macdonald, CEO of Fireweed Metals. We changed our name last year. We have a large zinc lead silver project in eastern Yukon, but we acquired the Macdonald tungsten project immediately adjacent to it, which precipitated the name change. So last year was an exciting year, this is an exciting year, and I'm happy to be on this panel.
Hi, my name's Paul Westsells. I'm the president and CEO of Western Copper and Gold. Western Copper and Gold's developing the Casino Copper Gold project. We've been developing it for about a dozen years, but the last 3 years have been really exciting. We almost doubled the resource about 3 years ago. The year after that, we brought in Rio Tinto as a major strategic partner, and then last year we issued a feasibility study on the project that looks really good. So excited to be part of this panel and to be talking about critical minerals.
Well, let's just start there and talk about what exactly is or are critical metals and minerals. Why don't we start with you, Brandon?
Well, look, it depends who you ask, right? So every government has a different definition of what's a critical mineral versus strategic mineral, and Canada has a list of, I believe, 32 metals and minerals that they deem critical, either because of supply constraints or geopolitical issues around where that supply comes from. For ourselves, you look at our two projects, zinc, lead, and silver. The one project, zinc, being listed as a critical mineral, and the other project, tungsten being on the critical mineral list. So it's an emerging concept, and one that emerged before in the 70s. It seems this time it's a little less half-baked, and maybe a little more serious pushes from government on it, which I think is certainly welcome.
Okay. Did anybody else have anything to add to that?
I just add that, I think not all countries, of course, but both Canada and the US have critical minerals lists. In Canada, there's a critical mineral list, and they made a number of announcements on the back of that. They made an announcement to invest, I think it's $2.7 billion into critical mineral development. Not a lot of detail on how that's going to come together, but also have offered up essentially a flow-through credit on the critical mineral exploration. So, the federal government is really pushing the critical minerals, and this is really on the back of looking globally around various countries and where can the world source critical minerals. And of course, a country like Canada, just because of the size, the mineral potential, and the stability of the government, is a very attractive jurisdiction.
Yeah, and I'd just like to add, while I think it is really important the government is developing this critical mineral strategy and its welcome approach, you could make the argument that all minerals are critical. And if we're waiting until some sort of catalyst requires a certain specific set to be identified, then maybe we're a little behind the 8 ball already. So it would be worth considering applying these initiatives and impetus to mineral development across the board.
Well, let's talk about the Yukon a little bit. You don't even have to be in mining to, when you think about the Yukon, you think about gold. So all three of you guys are up here exploring critical minerals in the Yukon. What makes it a desirable jurisdiction for that? We'll start with you, Robin.
Sure. As an explorationist, first and foremost, geology. You saw it in Michael's slide if you were here for that earlier. Yukon has tremendous geological endowment. I think of the 30-odd minerals that are identified as critical, Yukon lacks only a handful, 4, and those are likely potash and the things that just don't occur in the Yukon environment. So first and foremost, the geological endowment, for sure. And, despite being in the north, there is good infrastructure, there's great suppliers and contractors. When you look at the map and you see a few major highways that gain access to most of the territory, and beyond that, there are strips in the bush and lots of opportunities to access that geology. So I think it is a really, don't like to use the term world class willy nilly, but it is in terms of exploration is a great place to come explore.
Brandon?
Yeah, I think obviously infrastructure and geology are critical, but I think that what I've always enjoyed most about the Yukon is the collaborative effort, and that's within industry. So, for example, the groups like the Yukon Mining Alliance, where we collaborate for marketing. I think there's operational collaboration. We sit down with our neighbors and discuss how do we work together to make this a success. But in particular, collaboration with government. One of the benefits, obviously this pavilion here is in collaboration with the Yukon government, which is an amazing initiative. But also it's that by virtue of being a very small population, everyone kind of knows everyone. And if I'm in a British Columbia or a Nevada or a Western Australia, odds are I can't just send a text message to the premier or the governor or something like that, right? Where you can in Yukon. So you have, we had, investors come to site last year, and I was actually on site on our crappy Wi-Fi, and I sent a message to now Premier Ranch Palais, and it then was Deputy Premier, and I said, look, we're going to be passing back through the airport. These are important investors. Do you think you could meet us there? And he did, right? Wow. So on 2 hours' notice, you have the Deputy Premier meeting investors with you, which you will not have in virtually any other jurisdiction except one that's tightly knit like that. So I think that's essential to success, and I think that collaborative spirit is really what sets us apart.
I'll just build on that collaboration and because I think that's key, and Brandon was talking about the territorial government, but I think also what's important is the First Nation governments, and actually the relationship between the territorial governments and the First Nation governments is actually quite good in the Yukon. I mean, it's there's lots of differences of opinion, which isn't new, but I mean, I think one of the reasons that you've seen success, I mean, you've had mines open up over the past 5 years. You've got with BMC mine getting through permitting, lots of exploration, lots of activity. Is that the relationship between the territorial government, the federal government, and the First Nation governments, I think, is the best in Canada for a jurisdiction, and that brings investment into the area.
Okay. We hear a lot about the importance of critical minerals with the green economy. So can you tell me, Brandon, how you feel about that from your point of view?
Yeah, I think as we look to transition to a lower carbon economy, that there's no doing it without the metals that make that happen, right? So you can't build solar panels or this big electrical grid and all this stuff, offshore wind farms, et cetera, unless you have these things. And that, is something that I think is, knock on wood, I think beginning to register, not just with the investment community, but also with governments and First Nations as well. Like having discussions when you're talking about, look, we want to be part of this new low carbon future. You have this discussion with the First Nations government, and they distinguish between a critical mineral project now versus a precious metal project. And that's not to malign precious metal projects, because they can make real meaningful economic contributions and contributions to the well-being of these communities. But they recognize, I think, that the critical mineral projects that we're advancing to mine stage are doing more than that they're part of a global solution to a problem we're all facing.
Okay. Paul, did you have anything to add to that?
I think Brandon sort of covered it, pretty well. I think that, when you look at, obviously I'm most familiar with copper, and, on copper, you look at the Casino mine. Actually, the Casino mine is interestingly going to be the largest critical minerals mine in Canada when it's up and running. Wow. Just in terms of revenue, because both the copper and the molybdenum together are that significant. And when you look at copper, so this is a huge mine. You need 70 mines the size of Casino over the next decade to meet the copper requirement that's required globally to meet the climate targets that have been set. they're just not there. I mean, everybody here, I mean, just walk around. I mean, this is your exploration world. There's not 70 copper exploration companies probably here. It's going to be a real challenge, and so we really need to sort of push the early stage exploration on it.
Did you have anything to add to that, Robin?
Yeah, I think Yukon's in a real unique position, not only to be a major contributor of critical minerals in, with Casino coming online in the future, and our own project, which will be the largest zinc producer in Canada once in production. But also, it has the potential, because of the virtue that a lot of the mining in Yukon is either new, so like Victoria Gold, ourselves, Coffee when it comes online, or potentially to be overhauled in the instance of Hecla taking over Keno Hill. And by virtue of those newer modern operations, you're using more efficient equipment and techniques that overall the industry will produce less greenhouse gas per unit of productivity, however you choose to measure that unit. So I think Yukon has a really unique opportunity to take this greenhouse gas and new carbon reduced economy twofold, is producing less greenhouse gas per unit of productivity and producing a lot of the metals that we need to continue to move us there.
So that kind of leads into my next question, and that's, the argument is, we're mining all these metals for the green economy, but sometimes they're mined in a not a sustainable way, right? So, and I know we see that a lot maybe in other areas of the world, but how, what are your thoughts on that, with Canada and our mining practices here and your sustainability practices for your companies? I'm going to start with you, Paul.
Yeah, I mean, I think there's a couple of things I'd like to touch on with that. I mean, first of all, I'll just reiterate what I was talking about with, the territorial, federal, and First Nation governments, really working well. And
Right.
I mean, there's no mines that move forward in the Yukon without, it's actually woven into the regulatory process without significant input from the First Nations. So that, is part of that sustainability piece. I mean, the other part is back to what Brandon started off with about, being able to phone up the deputy premier and have him show up at the airport to meet. The government listens, and I think we're all excited here because one of the things that we've been pushing for as an industry is more grid power, green power to supply our mines, and so. The government's working on that. The Minister of Energy, Mines, Resources actually tweeted out, I guess a week ago, saying, I've been asked to look at connecting the BC and Yukon grids. I mean, that's going to be, it's part of the development of the Yukon. It's, I think we can all appreciate that connecting grids from a province to a territory is going to take some time, but it's an important step, and it's going to be, I think, a very important part of the future of the Yukon is having that green power, and then that leads into us having, a very green and clean copper, zinc, molybdenum, etc.
Did you want to go, Robin?
Sure. I think Yukon has a long tradition of environmental stewardship and responsible activities. You see it, I think, in all of the operators that are working. Certainly, I know all of us up here on stage try and uphold the best and most modern principles of reclamation and progressive reclamation, right? It's not the mine of yesteryear where you put the material in a pile and you worry about it later, right? All of these activities are carefully thought out from the beginning through all stages of the activities, and that's the culture. That's partly the collaborative culture that Brandon spoke about earlier, as well as the expectation in Yukon. And we see the government working collaboratively with the companies to try and make sure that this is ongoing and everybody's well informed on those activities and that they are happening responsibly.
Brandon, how do you feel about the sustainability with Fireweed Metals?
Yeah, I think what's been said here is pretty good, and I think I would just add that we of course want to be the best mining industry in the world, and that takes a few things. First and foremost, absolutely has to be the safest, right? Then you need these progressive and positive and forward-looking relationships with Indigenous communities and the broader territory. You want to be the lowest cost, right? You want to be the most robust mines in the world. And you also really, the new way that mines are going to get judged is carbon intensity, right? And so Paul touched on the grid connect to BC, which is going to allow, all three of our projects, for example, with a grid connect would be able to be powered by low carbon intensity, low cost power from British Columbia with that connection. Right. And that's what we're seeking. We recognize, all three of us have discussions, Paul with Rio Tinto, myself with Teck, et cetera, on these larger companies about how they get judged, how these big funds with ESG mandates invest in them, and one of them is the carbon intensity of their production, right? So we want to be the ideal project for them. So I think it's checking all those boxes.
We've talked about the power grid a couple times here. Did you have any thoughts on that, Robin, and how that might affect your project?
Yeah, it would affect our project quite substantially, provided the grid continued up the Robert Campbell Highway. That's always probably an internal question for Yukon to deal with. Which direction would the within territory infrastructure travel? But without a doubt, if we had access to hydropower from BC, it's clean, it's inexpensive, and it just not only drives the economics, but the reduced carbon intensity of our product substantially. So I think it's very important to look at not only that option, but also internal power generation within Yukon. I know the grid and the new power in BC is substantial, but as we see across the board, power gets used up pretty quick with all the Teslas and whatnot that people are driving around. So without a doubt, yes, the grid would be a substantial boon for Yukon and investment and into Yukon, without a doubt.
Awesome. When I was preparing for this, I chatted with one of our BTV producers on what he hears the most when he's talking to a company, with critical metals or minerals. And the biggest feedback that he has is that they can't keep up with the demand. Like, you can't build a mine fast enough for what, is needed out there. And I know you and I talked a little bit about land access and government funding. And do you have anything to add to that, Robin?
Yeah, I would actually just say that, if you look at that critical mineral strategy, and it's an end-to-end strategy, and it's very forward-looking and encouraging, without a doubt. I think part of the challenge is to deliver the product from the mines on time or with a predictable timeline to the other parts of the value chain, whether that's the refiners to the end users. Nobody along that chain can be sitting idle. So for a project to come online and deliver a product, we do need that predictable timeline, so that the other investment in the other pieces of the chain can also predict when they will be receiving a product and staff up and tool up and everything that goes along with building a multi-billion-dollar industry within the country.
Absolutely. Do you have anything to add to that, Brandon?
Yeah, look, I think the federal government and their critical mineral, overview. They talked about fast tracking critical mineral projects. I think the three of us, would view that with a high degree of skepticism that a project can be fast tracked.
Right.
Because fast tracking implies you're somehow skipping components of a process, right? And Yukon has a robust process. I think all of us think it could be equally robust while still being quicker. And I think certainly conversations I've had with First Nations are that they agree too. So it's a question of how do we reduce or eliminate redundancy in the process. How do we pre-engage in a way, and Yukon's beginning this pre-screening assessment process that we might be one of the first people to enter, where you're engaging your assessment body before you formally enter the process. There's lots of ways, and I think it's good that everyone from the federal government through the territorial and provincial governments and the First Nation governments are looking at, all right, we all want a solid, robust process that comes to the right decision. And if the right decision is a mine that's good for everyone, why shouldn't everyone want it as quick as possible? And I think at least we're on that same page, right? And it's baby steps as we slowly iterate through some changes and really improve those timelines. But I think it's going to happen for sure.
Okay. Paul?
Yeah, I think that I rolled my eyes when I saw that, we're going to streamline the regulatory process. But I mean, I think that to build on what Brandon was talking about, I mean, if you actually take the process as it is right now, and all the three levels of government, federal, territorial, and First Nation government, actually adhere to their timelines, really, you don't even need to change the legislation. It's just everybody needs to work a little quicker through the existing legislation, and you could cut, literally years off of some of the regulatory processes that are in existence right now. I mean, there's absolutely areas of duplication, and I've been working with various government organizations, government lobbying, I guess, organizations from the mining industry in the Yukon for over a decade, and it is literally, every 3 years, it's like, we need to reduce the redundancy of the regulatory process, and everyone gets excited about it, and then nothing happens. So I think that everybody just needs to sort of do their job, and maybe some of this money that's been announced at the federal level can really just go into better staffing, more capacity, and just keep the regulations the way they are.
Yeah, I would I'll just add to that it's not malice on behalf of bureaucrats that things are taking these long, right? It's like there's only so many hours in the day. You're getting pulled in a lot of different directions, and so I think staffing and capacity at every level of government is critical. If there isn't the capacity to handle these things, and of course, duplication of effort exacerbates capacity issues, but I think that hopefully this funding starts to go into like training and staffing for a lot of these things, which will allow them to handle things in a timely manner. Because certainly I found a lot of people within the assessment organizations and the licensing ones, they're really doing their best, but they're pretty thinly spread, right? So,
some stuff to add there, Robin?
Yeah, I mean, not to boil it down to a soundbite, but I mean, industry is always looking for a fair ride, not necessarily a free ride. So I think, earlier it was mentioned, fast tracking the process gets misconstrued as cutting corners, and no one in industry wants corners cut because it just will undermine the project in the future. So we're always, looking for that fair ride, not a free ride.
What are some major catalysts that you see working in critical minerals' favor coming up here for 2023, Brandon?
Look, I mean, I think the big catalysts are going to be the definition of what the strategy is, right? So we've seen an announcement about this $2.7 billion with no indication of like, okay, how do I access that funds, right? Like, because of course we're like, oh, great, awesome, gimme, but like no processes announced or defined. I think that's going to be a big catalyst. We start to see that. We start to see it allocated. I think we're going to see as between Canada and U.S. now as a collaboration framework on this. I think being able to work within that framework and engage other governments through a framework as well, because something like copper or zinc and tungsten and these are things that it's not just Canada that's seeking them, right? So being able to work through a framework with the U.S. government, with the Japanese government, EU, et cetera, to make these things happen, I think is going to be big. And fingers crossed, there's urgency there that gets these things going. And I have to say that it seems to be proceeding at a pretty good pace right now, this definitioning and fleshing out of the process. So I think that's going to be a big one. And I think, for all of us, when the first big, meaningful, critical mineral sort of collaboration, whether it's a funding or something is announced, I think all of us, will be able to point to it and be like, like we told you it was going to happen, right? So I think that'll be a big thing.
Very good. Paul, did you have anything to add to that?
Yeah, I mean, the biggest catalyst is going to be commodity prices, and
yes,
we've already seen it. Copper, I was amazed at how fast copper got back to $4 and then hit $4.20 and, sort of hanging out at $4.20 right now. I think, there's a whole team of analysts now sort of saying $5 copper before the end of the year. Molybdenum is another one for us. I'll be honest, I feel a little embarrassed. I actually had an investor phone me up and say, hey, do you know moly is now $33 a pound? I'm like, when did that happen? Sort of overnight it went from 14 to 30. Doubled. I haven't followed tungsten or zinc, sorry guys, but but they've done well as well. that raises all the boats, right? And it makes it easier to raise money. Investors are excited in the commodities, and it all sort of works together. And when I look at these commodities, I mean, again, back to just the scarcity. I mean, it's the difference between the demand and the supply. And the conversation forever was about the demand and global growth and what's that's going on. Now it's really coming back to the supply and the lack of supply. And I think that, I mean, this is why you've got chancellors of Germany coming over to Canada and talking to the Prime Minister and saying, hey, we need stuff from your country. And because they realize that there's a scarcity of supply when they look into the future.
For sure.
Yeah, I mean, I'd just like to add, and the cold hard facts of the metal prices and the devil's in the details of the policy notwithstanding, I think if anything, this critical mineral strategy campaign put out by the government, and it might not be such an immediate catalyst, but it's really, I think, created space for mining not to be a dirty word anymore. I think there's been a number of years where the mining industry has been unfortunately maligned by the general public, and I don't want to sound too whiny about it, but I think
definitely shifting though.
It's definitely shifting, and I think it's going to create space for people to ask questions why these projects aren't coming online faster, and why are we, why is this taking so long? So I think that obviously there's much more meat on the bone in that critical mineral strategy, but at the very least, it has created some positive space for the mining industry to promote ourselves publicly.
Sure. Paul and Brandon, you both had some pretty strategic investors come in for your companies in the past year. Can we touch on that a little bit? We'll start with you, Paul.
Yeah, I mean, it's been exciting. I mean, I guess it's now actually almost a little over a year and a half ago we brought in Rio Tinto as a strategic investor, and yeah, I mean, why were they interested in the project? Its size, its location, it's got to add up. I mean, the economics of it as well. So they've been great to work with. Not I guess deviating a little bit from critical minerals. Next to us is Newmont and the coffee project, so more gold focused. But if you go back, even I guess 5-6 years ago, there were no majors really active in the Yukon, and now with Rio Tinto, Newmont, and others, it's quite significant.
Brandon?
Yeah, we've been lucky that we've had Teck as an almost 10% shareholder since 2019, and late last year we added the Lundin family, the Lundin Group, as almost 20% shareholder, which is a pretty massive endorsement for us when a family puts in $20 million. So that's nobody bats 1,000, but they're pretty savvy, right? And so the fact that they can come to the Yukon and see the potential of our project and also see the opportunity within the territory, I think it's a pretty big endorsement. So there's so many, contrast, as Paul said, to 5 to 8 years ago, there's so many majors really poking around and indirect or direct ownership in the territory. I think big things are coming.
That's amazing. Before we kind of give a little bit more of a wrap up and get to some questions here, is there anything that you feel like we didn't talk about, in terms of critical minerals, more of an outlook for the year, or some points that we wanted to get to? Or was it very well covered?
I think we got everything covered up.
Yeah, okay.
I might just add that I think, critical minerals are driven by technology and innovation, so it's never a static set of minerals and criteria. So I think the government needs to be, watching, and as do we all, for what's the next big innovation and the next, rare mineral that looks uniquely poised to be in demand.
And what's next for BMC coming up?
For us, coming up, I mean, we're in the midst of the licensing process. So our quartz mining license has been submitted. Our water license has been submitted and is now currently open for public review and comment till the end of the week. And that's really the big push in the company right now is to get this project licensed and into development. We've sort of stopped trying to predict timelines around these things, but that final investment decision will likely come later in the year, or beginning of next year, as we get closer and if not completed through the licensing.
Awesome. And what should some investors know coming up for Fireweed Metals for the next year here?
Yeah, on the back of the largest ever investment in the company, it's going to be our biggest ever year, right? So it's a lot to plan, and we're excited about it. And so last year was our biggest ever, and this year will might be 3 times as big. So it's a bit daunting, but it's very exciting.
Paul?
Yeah, I mean, this is it's a big year for us on 2 fronts. I mean, one is that, I mean, our agreement with Rio Tinto will come to an end on November 28th. So, we'll see what the next steps are with us and Rio Tinto. So that'll be a big thing this year. And then the other big push is to get the project into the environmental assessment process. So lots of work on that front as well.
Awesome. Well, I'd love to open it up for some questions. Does anyone have a question for any of our panelists?
Hello. Look, just a question about commodity prices. So obviously some of the critical minerals are not as stable in terms of their supply, demand, etc. Tungsten, molybdenum, some of those are very volatile. And in the rare earths, we've seen China really manipulate their market position to affect prices. What do you see as the role of governments and some of these collaborations to provide better certainty on prices for some of these critical minerals?
Yeah, I can take that one, because I think we have probably, within our projects, have the biggest gap, right, between zinc and lead and silver, which have pretty efficient price discovery mechanisms being exchange traded. To the far side of that, tungsten, which is extremely opaque pricing. Sometimes it doesn't move for months and months, and that's not because it's not actually moving, and often handled on long-term contracts. So we see in tungsten that there's a new mine going into South Korea, where the Korean government is providing a price floor, which is helping insulate them from market manipulation from quota system in China. Whether that's needed in the more liquid commodities, I don't know. But certainly in the less liquid one, I think we need to be insulated a little bit from that sort of potential shenanigans.
Does anybody else have anything to add up there?
Yeah, I mean, obviously copper is a very liquid market and, well regulated. I mean, I think, part of price controls for commodities that see wild price changes is locking in long-term contracts and, when you're actually producing and those sort of things. It's interesting you talked about the role of government. I mean, our other big commodity is molybdenum. The LME actually started to do like an LME system on molybdenum, and I don't even know if it lasted a year before they sort of threw their hands in the air. So you need to have a fairly liquid commodity like copper and aluminum and that to have these sort of LME and COMEX warehouses and that sort of system that certainly stabilizes the price better, but it needs to be a pretty big commodity, I think, as evidenced by them trying to get into molybdenum.
Well, I think you look at the absolute chaos in the nickel market and them walking back trades on the LME. I mean, is the LME really as robust as we think? I mean, the nickel's a pretty liquid market, yet it basically went, no offer and skyrocketed, right? So,
no, valid point.
Yeah, and I mean, like Paul said, our commodities are fairly liquid and traded, and prices controlled by the market. But part of our strategy prior to development is to sign contracts with some of the major smelting houses to lock those prices in, or not lock the prices in, but so that we know what we're getting and provide some certainty prior to development.
I just want to thank Invest Yukon for hosting this great panel and a great 2 days, honestly, at the Vancouver Investment Conference here. And thank you, Robin and Brandon and Paul, for taking some time out of your day to chat with me. And yeah, it was great. Thanks, everybody.